Chapter 17, A Prisoner of Love, Maria of the Jador Opera House. It was Locke who first spoke after the rather awkward silence between the returners and Ramu.
I thought that espers lived in another world.
He questioned slowly, and Ramu smiled a little.
Well, that doesn't mean that we don't live here too,
he replied, and Locke opened his mouth to reply, though no words came. Ramu took that opportunity to continue.
Espers take a variety of forms. Sometimes we live here, taking the shape of humans. But you have nothing to fear from us. But then, why do you hide the fact that you are espers?
Edgar asked, finally recovering from the shock of the spastic Chere and the introduction made by Ramu.
Humans and espers cannot survive together,
Ramu replied sadly, but also matter-of-factly.
But my grandma told me that espers and humans once lived side by side,
Locke exclaimed.
Was it all just a fairy tale? No, it was not just a fairy tale,
Ramu said firmly.
That was true. We started out as friends, with no differences between us. And then came the War of the Magi. War of the Magi.
Celes trailed off, hearing of it so many times before.
It took place long ago,
Ramu began.
Espers fought humans who were infused with magical powers extracted from espers. Fearing our magical powers would once again become a target, we fashioned a new realm, and moved there. You may know it as our Esper world, for that is what it indeed is. But about 20 years ago, humans stumbled upon it. Humans who knew about our abilities and the secret to Magitek power. Thus began a hunt for espers. Only then could Emperor Gestal create his invincible army.
Celes turned red and looked away. Could Ramu tell what type of soldier she was? However, he did not seem to probe too much into the identities of the strangers that were before him. Instead, he continued on with his story.
In response to this, we erected a doorway, and threw the humans out. Even as we speak, many of my kind are trapped in the Empire's Magitek research facility, being drained of their powers. And I fled here to avoid a similar fate.
He sighed softly as Locke bent down and picked Chere up, gently laying her back down on her bed, pulling the covers back over her body to keep her warm. Ramu slowly made his way over to Chere, using his staff for aid as he walked. When he reached her, he gently reached down and pushed some of her white bangs out of her face.
That's right. Relax,
he murmured, and Chere let out a soft whimper. Ramu looked back to the returners, who were still gaping at him.
I sensed Chere was in trouble. My magic summoned her here. Chere is an esper?
Shadow asked suspiciously, and Ramu shook his head.
No, actually, she is quite different. She looks like she's in pain.
Sabin trailed off.
Isn't there anything we can do to help her? Celes, can't you cast a spell?
But Celes was interrupted by the old man.
Her very existence strikes fear into her own heart,
said Ramu.
But when she accepts this aspect of herself, I think she will be just fine again. But we have to do something,
Celes cried.
We can't just leave her here, like this. There is something you could do,
Ramu said calmly.
Free those of my kind imprisoned in Gestal's Magitek research facility. One of them can surely help her, I am sure of it. Normal magic, a simple cure spell, could not reach her troubled heart. But I am sure one of them can. them.
Locke trailed off, but Celes furrowed her eyebrows in worry.
You are sure that we can find your people in the Magitech research facility?
Sabin pressed.
That's so far. It's all the way in Vector, the capital city on the southern continent.
Edgar mused to himself.
Magitech research facility.
Celes trailed off and shook her head.
That means your people are.
She moaned and brought a hand to her forehead, as if she had a sudden headache. Locke blinked and walked over to her, resting a hand on her shoulder. However, she did not turn to look at him.
Like a coward, I escaped, leaving the others there. Soon, it will be the end of them. He means espers.
Shadow mouthed to himself wonderingly.
What do you mean?
Locke cried.
Gestal's methods are incorrect.
Ramu explained.
You cannot just drain a live esper of his power. It is only when we are reduced to magicite that our abilities can be transferred in total. Pardon?
Edgar blinked.
Magicite. What is that? When we transform into magicite, our power can be relocated.
Ramu tried again.
Whoever possesses it gains the complete spell-casting abilities, and even some of the attributes of the esper it once belonged to. Magicite is what is left of us when we pass away.
With that, Ramu pulled out 3 thin leather cords from within his many-layered robes, with small greenish gems at each end of them. On a closer look, the returners noticed they were kind of like necklaces, just very simple ones.
These are my comrades, Kiran, Stray, and Siren, who fell while escaping the Empire. And now, I will give you my power as well.
Ramu sighed heavily, but before anyone could stop him, a flash of light suddenly emitted from the orb of his staff, blinding the returners for a few seconds, yet it also filled the cold, damp room with a soft warmth. When the light had disappeared, all that remained in Ramu's place was another gem on a cord, floating on its own in mid-air. Locke blinked and reached out, taking the necklace in his hand. It was as warm as the light. It made his fingertips tingle as he closed it in his hand, looking down to the floor.
Are you really gone, old man?
He whispered, and Celes raised her gaze to him.
Locke. He traded his power, so that others might live.
She trailed off, and slowly rested her hand over his that was closed over the magicite. Locke nodded and looked back at Chere, who seemed to be having an easier time now. She had stopped moaning and tossing about in bed, and now looked halfway content.
Chere, wait for us, we will be back.
Locke promised loudly, and suddenly, the Ramu magicite began to glow softly, causing Locke to open up his hand some.
We few can help save many. The war of the Magi must not be repeated. Ramu!
Celes cried, but the magicite faded, and was soon back to the color it started out as. Locke took it and slipped it over his head and around his neck, tucking the stone underneath his shirt. Shadow walked over to the 3 magicites that Ramu had also left behind, giving one to Sabin, Edgar, and Celes. They all followed suit with Locke, slipping the necklaces on and hiding the stones underneath their clothing. No one said anything about Shadow not taking one. Suddenly, the slamming of a door echoed throughout the hallway and bedchamber, making the returners jump and return to their senses.
Who's there?
Edgar cried, prepared to use his flash tool if necessary.
Don't do anything drastic.
A voice cried.
It be me, and Sir Gao. Cyan?
Sabin asked, and to the group's surprise, both Cyan and Gao appeared in the bedroom, dripping wet and their chests heaving from their rushed breathing.
What are you two doing here?
Celes cried, and Gao jumped up and down.
Man!
Gao tried to explain, but he was too hyper to do a good enough job.
Sir Gao and I had a most interesting visit from an elderly spirit hours after you left.
Cyan explained.
He told us to come to you and Zozo immediately. I could not imagine why thou would be in such a wretched place, but we asked Banon, who insisted we take our leave immediately by Chocobo. I wonder if it was Ramu.
Celes trailed off, and rested a hand over her chest, where she could feel the magicite.
We have made a rather startling breakthrough,
Sabin said, and pointed to Chere on her bed. Cyan and Gao both gasped, and Gao made the move to approach her, but Sabin shook his head.
We can talk on the way back down,
Edgar suggested, and with that, the team turned and left Chere's private chambers, closing the door tightly behind them. As they began to walk away, Locke's Ramu magicite glittered, and a lock on the door appeared that was the same shape as the magicite on his necklace.
He must want to protect poor Chere.
Locke sighed, and looked up to the dark sky. The storm had finally ceased, but now it was getting later, and soon whatever daylight Zozo might have had would deplete completely. He could hear Cyan and Shadow saying their hellos as he began to climb down a ladder that was hanging from the balcony they were on. It was short, but it would not be too much of a leap to get to the next floor of the building. He decided there was no way they were going to attempt to get through the building that was swarmed over with slam dancers, and the others seemed to get his drift, finding new and creative routes to get down from the building.
The Empire is trying to drain magic from espers,
Edgar began to explain to Cyan and Gao. Sabin looked to Celes, who was trying her very best not to slip on a rusty crane that she was climbing down.
This can't be true, Celes.
Sabin questioned, and Celes looked to him.
I don't remember,
she said flatly.
I was asleep when they augmented me. But I've heard rumors to that effect, and believed them.
With that, she turned away, and leaped down from the crane, onto the same balcony Locke was on. They engaged in a quiet conversation, and Sabin ran his fingers through his damp hair. He didn't know what to think. Back at the entrance of Zozo, the returners had formed a small circle around the Chocobos. Locke, Celes, Edgar, Sabin, and Shadow had brought, along with the addition of 2 new ones thanks to Cyan and Gao. It was time to decide what their next step would be.
So we're going to try to get in the Magitech research facility,
Cyan cried, and put his hands on his hips.
It will be dangerous, no doubt. We have no choice. We need to find Ramu's people so that they can help Chere,
Edgar said.
But you're right. We may not make it out of this one so easily. Besides that, we'll have to split up to do anything. We still need people to protect Narsh. I am positive Banon and Arvis will not be able to hold out on their own for very long.
There was an awkward silence, for everyone in the group was wondering if they would sound cowardly if they were to be the first to volunteer to stay back in Narsh, which was guaranteed to be much safer.
I'll go to the Empire,
Celes suddenly said, much to everyone's surprise.
I know it well, obviously. But alone?
Sabin asked concernedly. Celes nodded, but Locke shook his head in protest.
Nah, don't worry, I'll go with her. Locke,
Celes protested, but he held up his hand, not wanting her to argue for now.
Need a hand?
Cyan asked, keeping his gaze on Celes as he volunteered himself. Celes narrowed her eyes, and sparks of bitterness could practically be seen flying in between them.
I'll go too then.
Edgar said, and looked to Shadow, Gao, and Sabin.
Unless you guys Gao like to stay in Narsh for now.
Gao replied.
Good training. Build strengths. Edgar, only if you promise to be careful.
Sabin warned, but Shadow shook his head, and brought his fingers to his lips, letting out a short whistle. A few seconds later, Interceptor came galloping towards them, barking loudly.
There is no need for me to remain with you,
Shadow said coolly.
You have a new mission now. Search out the Espers, and save your friend. Nothing I am too deeply involved or interested in at the moment. Very well, Shadow,
Sabin replied, knowing not to argue.
I hope we meet again. As do I,
Cyan exclaimed, and Shadow nodded to them. Without another word, he took off running with Interceptor, fading off into the darkness.
So it will be Sabin and Gao staying in Narsh then?
Edgar confirmed, and they nodded.
Please wait for us,
Locke said.
We'll come back safely. Goodbye,
Gao exclaimed, and jumped on his chocobo.
Come Mr. Thou. That's Sabin,
Sabin cried, but did climb on his own chocobo as well.
Be careful.
With that, the chocobos reared up for a moment, happy to be able to run off as far from Zozo as possible, and took off, kicking up some mud and puddle water behind them. As Sabin rode off, he reached down and pulled off his magicite, tossing it to a surprised Cyan. Edgar waved and Cyan asked him a few more questions about magicite as he slipped it around his neck. Locke turned and walked off on his own, staring at the ground, buried in his thoughts. They could save Chere, but at the same time they were attempting to save Espers. Espers, whom he thought were long sealed off from the human world. All of a sudden, everything he had been raised on as a child had been declared invaluable knowledge. Espers had been among humans all this time. But the Empire must have known that before everyone else, for them to be able to acquire Magitech power.
Locke,
Celes suddenly said, making Locke jump in surprise. He whirled around and faced her, putting on a slight smile.
Yes, Celes. Why are you coming with me?
Celes suddenly demanded, and Locke laughed nervously, hoping she could not see the color of his face clearly.
Well, there's bound to be tons of treasure there,
he exclaimed, and Celes looked as if she were about to fall over. Locke held up a finger and grinned.
Besides, I've always wanted an inside look at the Empire.
Celes slowly nodded, and smirked some as she walked away back to Cyan and Edgar. Locke wasn't sure, but he was almost positive he heard her mutter, "Men are fools," under her breath as she left him. He furrowed his eyebrows and crossed his arms over his chest, screaming, "They are not!" Celes turned around and cracked a smile, and Locke blinked, scratching his head.
I mean, I am not. Yeah, that's better. Oh, forget it. This is not the time for jokes. It sure isn't,
Edgar said worriedly, turning back to Locke and Celes.
How are we going to get to Vector? No ships sail there anymore. Maybe someone in Jador could help us,
Locke suggested.
Besides, it will be getting dark soon, and we should find a place to settle for the night. There is no way we can get to Vector by tomorrow morning anyway, so we may as well get somewhat comfortable. Good idea, Locke,
Edgar said, and walked over to his chocobo, giving it a pat on the head before climbing on top of it.
Shall we be off, returners?
As Celes got on her chocobo, she caught Cyan giving her a suspicious glare once again. She snorted and rolled her eyes to herself. How ridiculous! That he came to babysit her. The sky had darkened greatly by the time the returners had returned to Jador. Upon returning their chocobos to the stable in which they came from, they asked the owner of the stable for help on getting to Vector. However, he did not have much advice for them.
You might want to ask Ozer though,
he suggested thoughtfully.
He's the richest man in town, and might have connections. Connections?
Celes blinked.
Where is this Ozer? He lives in the mansion on the very north point of town.
The man explained.
You can't miss his house. It's the biggest one and it is the only home on the north point. It's surrounded by trees and probably swarmed by gardeners keeping them up. You might have trouble getting in right now though. He has important visitors this evening. Maria, the famous opera singer, an impresario, her advisor, and the owner of the opera house down south are visiting. We'll find a way in.
Edgar determined.
I mean, I'm the king of Figaro. Who would ever reject a visit from me?
He smiled proudly, and the chocobo stable owner laughed nervously.
I cannot imagine such a thing, sir,
he said.
But if you'll excuse me, it is getting late, and I have to close up for the night. Thank you for everything,
Locke said, and on that last word, the returners took their leave.
Let's pay Sir Ozer a visit,
Cyan suggested.
I just hope that he can do us some good. It's worth a try,
Edgar said.
Although, we look far from presentable.
Everyone groaned when they remembered that they were all soaking wet and muddy from mucking about in Zozo, but it couldn't be helped. So, the returners walked up to Ozer's house, getting a lot of strange looks from the people who were still out walking around. When they reached his home, which was way too large for any of their comfort, they found the rich oak door wide open, and shouting coming from within.
What's going on?
Edgar demanded.
Only one way to find out,
Locke exclaimed, and with that, stepped in the house.
Sir Locke, it's rude to just enter without a proper invitation,
Cyan cried, and Celes pushed past him roughly to follow Locke.
Oh, quiet! We've got to do what we've got to do,
Celes snapped, and Cyan looked as if she had just told him to jump off a cliff. He grumbled to himself as he cautiously followed Edgar, making himself the last to enter the home. Their feet left wet, muddy footprints on the soft white marble floor in the entryway, which were dimly illuminated by the candles hanging on the hall walls. The hallway then led to a short set of stairs to their right, and continued on ahead to another set of stairs a few feet ahead. Locke turned and looked up the staircase, seeing two men walking about on the floor it led to. The floor itself was actually just like a small bedroom, only it had railings around its perimeter instead of walls, so that one could look down to the hallway from above. One of the men had light brown hair, it was nearly blonde in the candlelight, which was slicked back with some sort of gel that made it look very shiny and reflect light off from the candles. He was also dressed very nicely, in a medium blue suit with long coat tails trailing down from his rear side and golden buttons accenting the front jacket. He was pacing about the room hurriedly, almost frantically. The other man was sitting in a soft burgundy easy chair across from the pacing man's path, dressed in a grey suit similar to the other man, his legs crossed as he held a small glass of a light-colored champagne in one hand, and rested the other on the arm of the chair. He sighed and took a sip of his drink as the pacing man whimpered something, and brushed back some of the dark brown tendrils of hair that had flopped over his eyes.
Why did this have to happen now?
The pacing man cried, raising his hand, which the returners noticed was grasping a letter very tightly, not taking heed of wrinkling it at all.
I don't know what to say, impresario,
the sitting man replied, and took yet another drink. He suddenly looked up, noticing the group of people at the foot of the stairway, and blinked. Impresario turned around and saw them too, his jaw nearly dropping to the floor.
He can't be that shocked that a bunch of muddy hooligans tracked their way into the house?
Locke joked, but the impresario paid him no mind. He instead swiftly made his way over to the group, and reached out, grabbing Celes's hand. She let out a surprised cry as he pulled her up the stairs and rested his hands at her shoulders. Cyan, Edgar, and Locke all looked to each other nervously.
Maria!
Impresario suddenly cried out, and Celes made a face in return for him being so close to her face.
My gods, you're filthy! Good lord, get off me!
Celes cried, and jerked back a little.
Are you talking to me? My name is Celes Chere.
Impresario blinked and suddenly stepped back, tilting his head to the side slightly as Celes glared daggers at him.
I'm sorry!
He suddenly cried, and wiped at the sweat on his forehead.
My mistake! Wow, you could pass for Maria in a heartbeat? Damn! Now I really am in trouble. Celes looks like Maria, that opera singer.
Edgar whispered to Locke, and Locke shrugged.
I've never seen Maria before.
He replied quickly. At that moment, a young man ran in and pushed past the returners, running up to Impresario.
Sir, a message!
The boy exclaimed.
Maria wishes to tell you she is at the opera house, but she is not coming out for any reason. She's hidden from you so that you would not take her to Jador, sir. What?
Impresario cried, and smacked his forehead.
It's all because of this damn letter. Oh well, no point in making the poor dear worry by dragging her up here with me while I was visiting Ozer. But she can't hide all night. We have a big midnight performance in a matter of hours. I must go back to the opera house and try to convince her to perform. I'm sorry this was so short, Ozer, and I'm sure you were looking forward to meeting Maria. Oh, don't worry about it,
Ozer said, somewhat sadly, and stood up.
Please give Maria my regards. I certainly hope you can persuade her to perform. I as well.
Impresario cried, and with that, ran out of the house, dropping the letter that was in his hand. Celes reached down and picked it up as Locke and the others joined her up in the small room. Ozer walked over to the returners and looked them over curiously.
That person forgot his letter,
Celes said, trying to hand it over, but Ozer just shook his head.
He's the director of the operas here in Jador. Everyone just calls him Impresario. He's been in a tizzy ever since that letter arrived. I wanna read it.
Locke whined, and Celes shrugged, handing it over to him. Ozer looked Celes up and down and turned slightly red.
It's true. You really do look like Maria. Body figure and all.
Celes gulped and slid over to Locke's side. These people were creepy, as far as she was concerned. Locke cleared his throat and read the letter out loud.
My dear Maria, I want you for my wife. I'm coming for you. The wandering gambler.
Locke blinked and dropped the hand holding the letter to his side. No wonder Maria didn't want to be out in public. He turned to Ozer, who did not look too surprised by the letter.
Who's this? Wandering? What's his name?
Ozer, who seemed to be a pretty level-headed character, suddenly burst out laughing, making Locke turn red.
Wah!
Locke cried, and Ozer smiled, almost mockingly.
You born on a farm, son?
He asked, and Locke put his hands on his hips in offense.
Actually, I was born in Co. He's a blackjack playing, world traveling, casino dwelling free spirit.
Ozer interrupted, and smirked.
That's Setzer Gabyani, owner of the world's only airship. An airship?
Cyan exclaimed, and Celes looked down at the floor in thought.
If we could get that airship, we'd make it to the Empire in no time.
She trailed off, and Locke smiled deviously.
Let's set up a meeting with this Setzer.
18. The Kidnapper, Gambler, and Pilot Extro. Chapter End.